So, the first thing I'd like to just have you explain to people is your background. First of all, who your parents were, where they came from.
First of all, I want to thank you, Doctor, for inviting me, and thank you, students, for being here. I appreciate the fact that you were kind enough and considerate enough to be here to hear what I have to say. I hope I have to say something that will be of some help to you, enlightening to you, and will help give you some guidance and some direction. My parents were both from the South, from the state of North Carolina, my father and my mother. They left the South at an early age. My mother moved to Connecticut. My father moved out to Ohio, where he attended college at Wilberforce University until World War I. Yes, there was a World War I. Some of you may have heard of World War II. That was my war.
That was the war to end all wars.
Huh?
That was the war to end all wars.
Yep, that's right. That was the war that was to make the world safe for democracy. Those of you who believe that the world is safe for democracy, raise your hands. Of course, no hands are raised, which I suppose means that you have deep an understanding of the facts of life. My father and mother, as I said, going back a bit, my father left the South and went to Ohio, went to college, and from college he was drafted into the Army. And he was stationed in Fort Dix, New Jersey. And in his movement around the country, he met my mother, and they married, moved down to Petersburg, Virginia, where my sister was born in 1919, my sister Inez, who is no longer living. She died some years back. And after living in Petersburg, North Carolina, Virginia for a year, my family moved to Fayetteville, North Carolina. Fayetteville, North Carolina is mainly noted for the presence of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which is a military base. And most of the soldiers who served in World War I and in World War II passed through Fort Bragg, North Carolina. So I was exposed to the military from a very early age. I knew about the Army, worked at Fort Bragg, and so I knew what soldiering meant and what the military life was about. So basically that's something about my beginning and where I got started and where my gene pool originated from. I hope I've answered your question sufficiently.
Are there any special lessons or anything or legacies that your parents left you or impressions that they left you that were important to you?
Can I speak to that?
Yeah.
Because that's one of the things that I think is important to understand about Herman, because of where Herman finally has ended up in life. His father is a very hard-working black man in the South who had to work hard to raise his 5 kids and managed to work hard and raise those 5 kids. One died early, but the other 4 went to college and got advanced degrees. Herman has an advanced degree. His brother's a dentist. Inez has an advanced degree. They worked hard, and his father and mother were very community-minded, and that is important. When we talk about a legacy, what legacy did they leave? They left a legacy of service to Herman. There is a school in Fayetteville now, Fayetteville Elementary School. Is now called, and it was built in I think 59, but I'm not sure. But it is now called the Ferguson Easley Elementary School. The school was named for his mother and father because of the work that they did in the community. So when we talk about legacy, I think that that is the most important thing, that he had a legacy of service. Now, they took different paths. He didn't take the same path as his father and mother did. But still, it was that attachment and that concern for his people and for the people that was in some way translated to Herman, and that Herman then went on, as his life moved on, to further serve the people, but in a different way. They were very, Barack Obama would talk about a middle class, aspiring family. They were that. And in his young days, Herman was that. You're going to be a good, strong American, and you're going to have a house, and you're going to raise your kids, and you're going to send them to college. They were all of that. All those ideals were there, but underlying all of it was that you had to serve your people. And if you understand when he says he was born in the South, that was very important. Very important. Everything that Mr. and Mrs. Ferguson did back then was done because there was so little available to the black community. And so they shared whatever they had, and they worked with whatever they had. And another thing, the school is named after his parents, but also the first public library for black people, because we weren't good enough to go to the library with white folks in them days, right? But Mrs. Ferguson started a reading room, so that people that came in town and had to wait for the bus or their neighbors and had something to do. And from that reading room, first it was a table, then it was a reading room, and then it became a public library. So there's a great legacy of service to black folks from the Ferguson family.
I'd like to add one other thing that my wife said, that the school that was named after my parents was named the Ferguson Elementary School. A few years after that school was established, because my oldest sister, the oldest one of the siblings in my family, had continued the legacy of community work and working in Fayetteville, that they added her name, her wedding, her marriage name, to the school. So it became the Ferguson Easley Elementary School.
So that kind of indicates part of your personal background.
Mm-hmm.
So, as your wife pointed out, you picked up service, but you picked it up in your way. And so as a young child, how did that affect you? And then as you grew up, I understand you went to school and stuff. Explain that.
Yes. My parents were both very religious people. My father was very active in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. My mother was very active in the Baptist Church. I went to church on Sunday. I went to Sunday school. My father was the superintendent of the Sunday school. So, of course, I had to be there, along with my other brothers and sisters. My mother chose that opportunity to get away from the kids, and she went to the Baptist church, which was a different church. So my father would take us to the AME Zion Church, where he kept an eye on us during the Sunday school services and the church services. And then we'd see my mother in the afternoon after we'd come back from church services, and she would prepare the Sunday dinner. So I became very active in the church. I believed all of the stories that my parents told about there being a heaven in the sky and some white guy who had a long beard and had somebody they called God. And we were supposed to worship that person and be loyal to him and to all of his angels. So I believed all of that stuff. And it stayed with me for a number of years until I began to move about and experience some of the lessons that life has to offer you. I was very observant, and I watched carefully, noted what was going on around me, listened to what people had to say, especially older people, and some younger people too. And I questioned things. I didn't accept everything that was said to me as being the gospel truth. I was very questioning about why is that so? Why do you say that? Why is there such a place as heaven? Why are we treated the way that we're treated? Why are white people given the benefit of everything? Everything seems to be on their side, and we black people don't have anything. So I was always asking why? And so I developed a questioning attitude. I did not accept everything, even from my teachers, that they said as the gospel truth. I questioned everything, and I think that is something that you might yourselves benefit from. As college students, I would expect you to have an inquiring mind, to ask your teachers, to ask your ministers if you go to church, if you belong to a church, why? Why is that so? Why is that this so, and why is that so, and why things the way that they are? And I think that by questioning so much, you begin to look for answers. And in looking for answers, you begin to seek out people who have a different slant on things that are happening in our world, in your world. So I think that is very important, and that is the thing that motivated me and kept me going and directed me. The whole attitude of not accepting what was said to me because it was somebody who was supposed to be an authority and knew. They had to prove me. They had to come good, you know. And so I think that that is one of the things I hope that those of you who are here in this room today have accepted that way of questioning everything about that's said to you and about you.
As you grew up, I understand with your parents' educational background and everyone in your family pursuing an education, what kind of education did you pursue?
Well, I went to public school in Fayetteville, North Carolina. I went all the way through grammar school and high school, and then I went off to college in a town called Salisbury, North Carolina, and the college was Livingston College. And I went to school there for 2 years, and then in my second year I transferred out to Ohio, to Wilberforce University, where my father had gone to school, and I finished my training, my education there. I started to say training. Yes, it was training. It wasn't an education. And I hope that you students here are getting an education and not training such as I got. I was trained to accept certain ways of life, to see certain people as being superior beings, and that I myself was something inferior and not part of the ruling class or the part of the people who were in charge of anything.
Very important.
Mm-hmm.
So once you left college, what did you end up doing? And what degrees did you pursue in college?
Right. I received a Bachelor of Science degree in education, health and physical education, and I went to. I joined the Merchant Marine, and I served in the Merchant Marines for 5 years. My first trip was to Murmansk, Russia, and after going to Murmansk, Russia on my first trip, I made my second trip to Africa. And then from there, I made a second trip to Russia. And I spent my 5 years of service in the Merchant Marines.
As opposed to being in the military.
Yes, because when I tried to volunteer for the military, I should point out that I took 2 years of the ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps work in Wilberforce. And when the war broke out, I felt that I had this military training. I had lived around the soldiers in Fort Bragg, so I was very much into the military way of doing things, and I was inspired by wanting to be part of the defense of my country. And so I volunteered to go into the service. But I found a strange thing. I found that I, as a black youth, a college graduate, I was not wanted by the American government, which I couldn't understand. So I was turned down by all of the services that I attempted to volunteer for. I attempted to join the Marine Corps, the Signal Corps, all of the branches of the services. And every one of them turned me down based on my color. I'll never forget the experience with the Signal Corps. I wrote them a letter and explained to them that I had this training in the ROTC, that I had also had training in wireless telegraphy, and I knew something about wireless electricity, and I thought that I would be a good candidate for their training program to train up their cadets, their cadet officers. And so they asked me to come in. At that time, I was living in Philadelphia, and I was working in a shipyard, the Sun Shipyard Company, where we were building ships that were supposed to be delivering soldiers and weapons and other goods to the war fronts. So I went there in Philadelphia to the Signal Corps. And I always remember when I walked into that office, a young corporal, a white boy, met me out in the outer office, and he said, "Yes, how can I help you?" I said, "My name is Herman Ferguson, and I have been given a letter by you people to come in to volunteer for the training program that you have, and that's why I'm here. I'm ready to volunteer." So this young man, who wasn't much older than me, he said, "Well, wait a minute, just have a seat." And he went in the back room, and he was gone for a few minutes, and when he came back, he said to me, "Ferguson has," and he mentioned the officer's name, I can't remember his name, but he said, "Has this officer ever met you or seen you?" I said, "No." He said, "He doesn't know that you are not white. He thinks you're white. With your background, he assumed that you were white. But he told me to tell you that we are not enlisting any black officers. You're not eligible." And I said, "What? But you're supposed to be fighting a war to make the world safe for democracy. I need some democracy too. And so why can't I be a part of the Signal Corps?" And he hemmed and hawed and he beat around the bush, but to make a long story short, they turned me down. And at that point, I decided that the United States government could take its war and its military and shove it. That it was not for me. They didn't want me. I didn't want them. And that's when I joined the Merchant Marine. A friend of mine, a classmate, came by my home. He was working at the shipyard. And he said to me, "Herman, I'm volunteering. I'm leaving tomorrow." I said, "Well, where are you going, Doc?" We called him Doc. He said, "I'm joining the Merchant Marines." I said, "Man, you're crazy. You're out of your mind. They're sinking those ships faster than we can build them. So why are you joining the Merchant Marine?" He said, "Because they're integrated. They don't have any discrimination. So they will take black recruits and give you the same kind of training that they give the whites in the same classrooms." And he said, "So I'm joining." I said, "Are you sure of that, Doc?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, that's for me." And he said, he looked at me in disbelief. what you know, he knew how I felt about the military, but he said, you say that you're going to join the merchant? I said, yeah. If it's not segregated, that's for me. And so I went and joined the Merchant Marine. But Doc didn't believe it. And so when he and I met up with each other in the Merchant Marines, he was more shocked than I was to see how this guy who had turned my back on the military and said that because they didn't want me, I didn't want them. But I decided that the Merchant Marine was the place where I would do my service.
Did you end up teaching after that?
Yes, after the war ended, I couldn't find a job, although I had a degree and had the 5 years of service in the Merchant Marines. It was very difficult for me to find a job. And again, the ugly specter of discrimination reared its head. I just couldn't find a job that I felt was the type of job that I should have with the kind of training and education that I had. And so my wife said to me, you have a degree from Wilberforce, so why don't you go for your bachelor? You have your bachelor's degree, so why don't you go for a master's degree and qualify yourself to teach in the New York City public school system and take some of those exams that they're giving that for potential teachers. New York State had a system, and New York City had a system that they gave exams for all of their teachers and their supervisors. When you pass those exams, then you were eligible to be appointed as a teacher or as a supervisor. So I went to New York University Graduate School and I got my master's degree in education and took the exam and became a substitute teacher and began teaching in the New York City public school system. Later on, I took the examination for assistant principal in the New York City public school system. I passed that examination and I was appointed as one of the first and early assistant principals in the city of New York. And so I spent the next 17 years teaching and working as an assistant principal in this public school system of New York City.
So now let's get down to where the rubber hits the road. What led to your political activism? And of course, we're talking about your, not the Democratic and Republican Party.
Well, you know, basically, as I going back to some of the things that I said earlier, I had a questioning mind. When somebody said something to me that this was the truth, this was it, that's the way it is, I always wanted to know why. Why? How do you know? And so by questioning everything that I saw around me, I began to come to certain conclusions myself. And I realized that things were not the way that my teachers and my minister had said that things were. Things were a bit different. They were different. And I wanted to know what made the difference. Why was I different? Why was I treated different? Why wasn't I treated like everybody else? And so I began to look around, and as I traveled with the Merchant Marine, I went literally around the world, going to various ports, and I saw the conditions under which people lived, and people were supposed to be helped by the American government and the Allied forces who were fighting against Hitler, promising these people the fruits of democracy. And I saw that it was not like what they were saying, that the democracy that they were selling resembled more like what the Germans were given to their people than the democracy that I thought that they should be passing out. And so I began to look for answers to the questions that I was raising. I began to question, first of all, my religion. I couldn't believe any of this. There was no evidence that any of these things that I was hearing were true. And so I said, there must be another way, another answer to the problems of my people, because I had come to the conclusion that black people were a group of people who had no power at all. Nobody really respected black people, what black people thought about, what we were concerned about, what we believed in. And so I thought there must be some answers that would deal with the plight of black people. Even back in those days when we were catching holy hell, the Ku Klux Klan was running amok. People were being lynched. There was no integration of any sort. And I said, there must be an answer. Somebody must have an answer. And so I said, I'm going to make it my business to try and find that person or those persons who are concerned about the treatment of my people and who are often trying to find answers to the problems that we're confronted with. I wanted to join up with those people. And I said that when I find out who those people are, I'm going to cast my lot in with them.
So who were the first people you met that led you to cast your lot in with them? And what was it that they were running down or doing that impressed you?
The first group of people, or the first set of people that I ran into, was in the Merchant Marine. Some of the seamen in the Merchant Marine had been, first of all, they belonged to a very liberal union, the National Maritime Union, which had an open door policy. They didn't discriminate against any of the workers in their union, and any job that you could qualify for, you could throw in for that job, and you could have that job if you were qualified. That was the only requirement that they raised. Were you qualified? Did you have the experience? And if so, you could have that job. And so when I met these fellows, most of them were people who were opposed to what the United States government was offering under its so-called program of democracy. They talked about what the United States government had to offer and the lies that they were spreading and the way they were treating so many of its citizens, lynching us, sending us to prison, doing all kinds of things that had nothing whatsoever to do with democracy. And I found out that most of these people did a lot of reading, and they read literature, books that I had never been exposed to. They read literature that was written by philosophers, and they followed to politicians who preached a different kind of politics than what the United States government was putting out. And so I was influenced by people like that. And as I went on, I began to look further to find more people like this. And it was through my searching in that direction that I eventually met the Nation of Islam and Brother Malcolm. I came under the contact of Brother Malcolm.
What was the first time you met Brother Malcolm, and what impression did he leave you with? What was he doing? What do you remember?
Malcolm, at the time, I was working for the Board of Education at the time, and Malcolm was the second in command almost to Elijah Muhammad for the Nation of Islam. And he was going around preaching the word of Elijah Muhammad. He was also the minister of the mosque there in New York City, which meant that Malcolm was based in New York City, and so much of his work was done there in New York City. And he preached and walked the streets of Harlem. and the other black communities of New York City and Brooklyn and Queens. And so I came in contact with what Malcolm was talking about. I watched him on television, I listened to him on the radio, and I was influenced by Malcolm's spoken word, but I had never met him. When I first met him, I went to a rally that some of the civil rights organizations like CORE, SNCC, the Student Nonviolence, the Student, what's the?
NAACP.
Yes, the Student Nonviolence Coordination Committee, and National, what's the other organization?
NAACP.
The NAACP, and all of those organizations. They were having a rally to protest the fact that a housing development was being put up in Queens, in an area near where I lived. And this was supposed to be an integrated housing project. And they wanted to be sure that the builders of this project would live up to their words and would make the housing available to black and whites. And so they wanted to be sure that all of the residents in that area would come out to the construction site and demonstrate against the builders of the housing project to ensure that they would hire black workers and would also hire black or give housing to black tenants. So it was on a Sunday in a parking lot adjoining a supermarket. At that time it was A&P Supermarket, Atlantic and Pacific Supermarket. And most of the civil rights leaders, the heads of those different organizations that I just mentioned, were there for this rally. And there were hundreds of people there to hear what they had to say. In the midst of all of this going on, I noticed that at one point, most of the people who were there, their attention was turned away from the stage where these civil rights leaders were talking about what was happening, and everybody's attention was devoted towards the arrival of a tall brother who was accompanied by a couple of other tall brothers, and he entered this parking lot and stood near the edge of the crowd with a smile on his face and was looking and listening to what they were saying. And as I looked over at him, it dawned on me that I had seen this man before. And I put two and two together and I realized that that was Malcolm X. This was the man that I had seen on television. I had seen him on street corners talking and lecturing. And this was Malcolm. He was not part of this demonstration or anything of the sort, but he was very much in evidence. And the people around him began to gravitate towards Malcolm. Like a magnet, they moved towards Malcolm. And I too began to move towards Malcolm. I just wanted to be close to Malcolm because I had listened to what he had to say, and I thought that Malcolm had a lot to say that dealt with the problems of people who were maligned and mistreated by other people, by particularly the American government. And so I didn't say anything to Malcolm. I didn't speak to him. He didn't speak to me, although he smiled and nodded, and that was about the end of it. And so the meeting ended, and I went home. And when I told my wife that I had seen Malcolm, and that they were asking everybody, Malcolm was not part of that meeting, but they were asking, the civil rights leaders were asking for people to come out and support them at the meeting the next day, so that they'd be sure that black workers and black tenants would be hired and given jobs in the building of this housing development. And so the next morning, a Monday morning, school was closed. It was the first day of July, I'm sorry. And my wife came and said, are you listening to the radio? I said, no. She said, listen and watch television. And so I turned the radio on and listened, and they were talking about this Rochdale Village movement, a demonstration at this Rochdale Center. And she said that they're asking everybody to come out and demonstrate in support of jobs for and housing for black people. And why aren't you out there? And you've had so much to say about the way they've treated us and so on. I don't know why you're not out there supporting their call for demonstrations. And so there was nothing I could say because she was calling my bluff. She said, you're just like the rest of them. You're just talking and there's no action. And so I reluctantly got out of bed and said, okay, I'll go over there and see what's going on. And I went over to to the site of the construction. And there I saw the civil rights movements. I saw them for the first time in action and how they went about demonstrating and trying to get jobs for black people. And I didn't like what I saw. First of all, I had been accustomed to when our union, National Maritime Union, went out on demonstrations to better conditions for the working people. We made sure that we not only fought with the owners and the managers of the job, but we also fought the police. But the civil rights leaders, they didn't do that. They made a big to-do about being friendly with the police, laughing with the police brass, joking with them, and not being serious at all, and not being at all concerned about what they were trying to get done. And I said, this is not right, because the people who had been brought out there by the civil rights leaders, they were walking in front of these trucks and vehicles, of construction vehicles, and stopping them from delivering their work supplies for the building of these houses. And the police would come and arrest these people, take them down to the courthouse, where a friendly judge, would fine them $5 or something similar to that amount of money, and return them to the picket lines. And I said, there's something wrong here. That these workers are being fooled, they're being deceived by these so-called leaders. And I said, well, I can't be a part of that. But as I watched what was taking place, I became more and more concerned about how these civil rights leaders were leading these people who were serious about jobs and housing, leading up a different road. And so I decided that I would cross the street and join the picket line, trying to get jobs for black people and housing for black people. And so I walked across the street and joined that picket line. And that's how I got involved, reluctantly, in the civil rights movement. I did not support the civil rights movement. I didn't believe in any of the things that they talked about. I didn't believe in King's message about you loved your enemy, and when your enemy struck your on the left side of your cheek, you turn the right side of the cheek and let him hit you there. I felt that if anybody hit me on my cheek, I would do what Malcolm used to say that the Muslim would do. You hit a Muslim, he would send you to the graveyard. And that's what I believed in. There's no love for your enemy. I never heard of anything like that. And so I felt that maybe by joining in that movement, I might find some people who had the same motivation that I had, that instead of loving your enemy, you know, you meted out to him the same treatment that he meted out to you. If a policeman went up against your head, you retaliated. You know, the policeman, you went up against his head. And you did not take any guff from the police or anybody. You know, you were a man just like anybody else. And so that was what I joined the civil rights movement for, looking for people who felt the way I felt, who believed in an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And that if anybody took any measures or to harm you, you gave back to them exactly what they gave to you.
So what did you find in the civil rights movement, and then what was the connection of that to Malcolm?
I found a number of people who, when you talked to them and got to know them, they felt the way that I felt. But there was no way that they could express those feelings. And so the only thing that they knew to do was to get involved with the civil rights movement. But they too believed that if the police went up against your head, you retaliated, you know. And that anything that they meted out to you, you gave it back to them. You know, and if somebody hit you, you sent it to the graveyard. That was it. And so by that time, I began to collect around me a group of people who shared my thinking about the way that the movement should begin to develop. And the Muslims, the Nation of Islam people, the fruit of Islam, the FOI, and other members would come around the construction site. Elijah Muhammad did not allow them to get involved with those demonstrations because he did not believe that the civil rights people were in their right minds. And so he forbade his people from getting involved. And Malcolm supported that position. But they were allowed to come around those sites like that and sell their newspapers. Muhammad Speaks. And so we worked out a deal with them because the members of the Nation of Islam came out of the school systems in Queens and in Harlem and so on and so forth. And so they would take our leaflets and our flyers spelling out the injustice that was being perpetrated against black people, and they would put those leaflets in their newspapers. So when they sold the newspapers to passers-by, when they would buy the newspapers and open it up, of course they had to read our flyers, condemning what the United States government was doing to black people and to other people. And so this way the Nation of Islam people were defying, in a sense, what Elijah Muhammad was saying to them, that they were not to become involved with the civil rights movement people. And we were getting our word out to the public. We were involving them and bringing to them the attention that we were trying to get them to become aware of.
Do you think that Malcolm was a part of that, defying the nation in a way in terms of some kind of relationship to the civil rights movement?
Malcolm was a severe critic of the civil rights movement. He was a severe critic of King, of Roy Wilkins, who was the secretary of the NAACP, James Foreman, who was head of CORE, who was head of SNCC? Anyway, I can't remember.
Foreman.
George, what was his name?
James Foreman.
No.
That was cool.
Okay.
No, James Farmer Core.
Yeah,
James
right,
Foreman
right.
Smith.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I can hardly remember their names. But Malcolm felt that these guys were fooling the people. He said they were sending these people up the wrong avenue. and they would get nothing for their commitment to or concerns about the civil rights movement, but get their heads whipped and sent to jail. And so Malcolm criticized them. But at the same time, Malcolm himself was very concerned about the treatment of the United States government towards its black so-called citizens. And he preached about the fact that we were a nation of people. The only thing is we did not have any land, and he preached about we should have land of our own, specifically in the southern part of the United States, and that we should fight against what the United States was doing to us, and that we needed a nation that would represent us, even back in those days, that would represent black people before the United Nations and plead the case against the United States government for its opposition to the rights, the human rights of its people. And Malcolm said that the civil rights movement, which was fighting for the civil rights, was barking up the wrong tree. It wasn't civil rights that we needed, it was our human rights. That we, by the fact that we were born as human beings on this earth, wherever we were born, we had every right that anybody else had. And that the civil rights that the United States government claimed that it was given to us was something wrong. It was a flim-flam. And that these civil rights were our rights because we were born and we were also supposed to be covered by the Constitution of the country that we were born into. Those were our civil rights, and they were given to us by the Constitution and the laws of that country. And that the human rights were the divine rights that all people had by the fact that we were born and we were human beings and we were on this earth. And so that's what Malcolm believed in. And that's what he felt that we should be fighting for, our human rights rather than our civil rights. And that we should take our civil rights and enforce our human rights and force the governments of the world to recognize ourselves as human beings. And that I bought into. I could see that. I could understand where Malcolm was coming from. And he was the only leader at that time who was preaching that message. Malcolm was the only one that I could believe in, that I was willing to go wherever he led me. Malcolm was the only one. Not King, not Roy Wilkins, not the other jokers. And that's what I thought they were. Malcolm was for real. And I still believe that Malcolm had the ability and the understanding of leading a real movement towards the relationship, the freedom of our people, and the getting of our human rights, the earning of our human rights, which we would take. Nobody would give us our human rights. We would take them. And once they were taken away from the people who were holding them from us, they could never be taken back. Malcolm said that if human rights are given to you, human rights, because they would be given to you, you didn't struggle for them, they could be taken away from you. But human rights, you would fight for your human rights, and they could not be taken away from you. And he made those distinctions between civil rights and human rights, and that was what I bought into. And that was what it caused me to dedicate myself to what Malcolm was teaching and preaching to us, and to turn my back on what the civil rights, what the civil rights people were talking about. I had no. And incidentally, I went as far as I could in support of looking for something in the civil rights movement that I could support. I attended the Civil Rights March in Washington in 1963. I went, and I had an unpleasant experience which pointed out to me that John F. Kennedy was as big a hoodlum as any of the other civil rights leaders. And he had no more to offer us as a people than any of those other guys and I felt that they all should have been locked up.
Now, in the Nation of Islam, and you get into Malcolm in the Nation, what did you view as Malcolm's role in the Nation, the positive contributions that Malcolm made to the Nation made to him? And I've read where you said it became a straitjacket for him. Where did you see that coming in?
I felt that those of you who have, incidentally, have any of you in here read Malcolm's autobiography? 1, 2 hands. You got to correct that. You got to correct that. Read Malcolm's autobiography. Anything else you can read about Malcolm. He was a great man. I think that Malcolm, when you read his autobiography and other writers about Malcolm, he started out as a hoodlum. He had turned his back on the system, and he became a pimp, a hustler, a numbers writer, and his father had been killed at an early age, and his mother had been left with 8 or 9 children to raise, and she herself had a nervous breakdown, and the state of Michigan confined her to an insane asylum. And so Malcolm's brothers and sisters had to raise themselves. And so Malcolm went to Boston and lived with his half-sister, Ella Collins. And he eventually wound up in prison. He had no real family. And so the Nation of Islam, when he finally was introduced to the Nation of Islam, that became his family. That was Malcolm's family, the only family that he knew. And the teachings of Elijah Muhammad wrote Malcolm a letter. Well, first of all, Malcolm wrote to the Nation of Islam and expressed his interest in becoming a member of the Nation of Islam. And Elijah Muhammad wrote to Malcolm and welcomed him into the nation and told him if he would write a letter and ask to be admitted into the Nation of Islam, when Malcolm was released from prison, the Nation of Islam would have welcomed him as a member. And that is the way that it happened. And that became Malcolm's family. I think the greatest contribution that they offered to Malcolm was those brothers and sisters in the Nation of Islam became Malcolm's family. Although all of them did not become sympathetic to Malcolm, the majority of them understood what Malcolm was about and appreciated Malcolm and supported him. To the extent that when the Nation of Islam, when Elijah Muhammad put Malcolm out of the Nation of Islam and Malcolm had to form his own organization, many of the members of the Nation of Islam followed Malcolm into his new organizations, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated and the Organization of Afro-American Unity. So they offered Malcolm a home, a family that he did not have. Malcolm offered to them his intellect, his brilliant mind, his commitment to the human rights of all people, but particularly to the human rights of black people, and to the freeing of black people from the imperialism and capitalism of the United States government, and forming a new system where all men would be equal under the law. I think that was what Malcolm offered to the Nation of Islam and what the Nation of Islam offered to Malcolm.
You said that you saw a point where the nation became a straitjacket. At what point or why did you make that observation?
But Malcolm realized after a time that the program that was being taught by Elijah Muhammad had a lot of contradictions in it. And he felt that many of the people who were in the Nation of Islam were being led astray by Elijah Muhammad. And you can read this in, if you read Zach Condo's book, Malcolm's Assassination, he goes to a great extent along that line about how so many of the people who accepted Elijah Muhammad's teachings as the gospel truth, Malcolm began to realize that these people were, to a large extent, being led astray, and they should have questioned more carefully what was being taught to them. So Malcolm began to have doubts about the moral persuasion of Elijah Muhammad. And when he came in contact, or it came to his attention that Elijah Muhammad had begun to misuse some of the women in the Nation of Islam, particularly the secretaries who were assigned to work in his office. And Malcolm exposed that. And I think that was when it became obvious to those people in the Nation of Islam who were close to the Elijah Muhammad and who made up what was called or known to some people then as the royal family. These were the close people around Elijah Muhammad who served as advisors to Elijah Muhammad and who were his lieutenants and supporters. They began to use their influence to poison Elijah Muhammad's mind against Malcolm. They said Malcolm is preaching his own message. He's deviating from your scripture, and he's preaching Malcolm's message. And they cited the fact that after Kennedy was assassinated, at a meeting, a rally that they had, the Muslims had in New York City, where Malcolm was going to speak in the place of Elijah Muhammad. And when Malcolm finished his speech, some person, I think a newspaper reporter, a white newspaper reporter, got up and said to Malcolm, well, Minister Malcolm, President Kennedy has just recently been assassinated. What is the position of the Nation of Islam in this matter? What do you all say about the assassination of of President Kennedy, this beloved figure? And Malcolm, in his manner, he was a very thoughtful speaker. He always chose his words very carefully. He paused for a moment and then he said, well, I have no problem with it, or words to that effect. He said, to me, it was just a case of the chickens coming home to roost. He said, and the fact that the United States had been preaching this phony democracy and so on and offering it to the rest of the world, the chickens in Kennedy's instance had come home to roost. The death of Kennedy was the chickens coming home to roost. Well, it only took the first person who could get to the telephone and call Elijah Muhammad to say, you see what we told you? This is what Malcolm has said, and you told Malcolm and all of us not to say anything about the death, the assassination of Kennedy. And Malcolm is saying that it's that we are feeling that it's a matter of the chickens coming home to roost. And this is what proves what we said, that Malcolm is no longer following your lead, but he's preaching for himself. And he needs to be thrown out of the nation. And at that point in time, the die was cast. And Elijah Muhammad began to see Malcolm as someone who was working against him and someone he needed to get out of the Nation of Islam. And so it only took a short while for the Nation of Islam, for Elijah Muhammad, to dismiss Malcolm from the Nation of Islam.
When Malcolm formed the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, what were the objectives that he stated for the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and what was your involvement in that?
Malcolm realized after he was put out of the Nation of Islam, and incidentally, he fought a hard battle to stay within the Nation of Islam. He wrote letters, he sent telegrams, he sent messages, he sent emissaries to Elijah Muhammad. He called on the phone. He did everything he possibly could to make Elijah Muhammad understand that he, Malcolm, was loyal and still loyal to him. And he did not want Elijah Muhammad to put him out of the Nation of Islam, but to no avail. And so he felt that I'm trying to follow.
What were the objectives?
Yeah.
Once Malcolm set
Okay.
up the
Yeah.
Muslim
Right.
Mosque Incorporated?
The objectives of the Muslim Mosque Incorporated. One, Malcolm realized that one of the strong supports he had was the religious base of the Nation of Islam. And he felt that before he could continue his work and to have any effect, he would have any following, he needed to have a religious base. And so the Muslim Mosque Incorporated would offer that religious base because it would be molded after the Nation of Islam and would offer the Orthodox Muslim religion to the believers. And that was the purpose of the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, to offer a religious home to those Muslims, those people who took the religion of Islam seriously. And so that's what he felt that the Nation of Islam, or the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, offered to those converts who came over to his side. A religious home. That's what they needed, and he felt that would be to his advantage and would be to the advantage of these converts moving over from the Nation of Islam to the Muslim Mosque Incorporated.
Were there any specific programs that he announced and carried out? And I understand you were a part of the Muslim Mosque Incorporated for a short time.
Yes.
What was your involvement?
After Malcolm, well, first of all, let me see if I can follow the timeline. Malcolm came out of the Nation of Islam sometime, I believe, in March of 1965 or thereabouts. A couple of months after that, he formed the Muslim Mosque Incorporated.
1964.
1964 it was. What was it that you were-
Programs.
Yeah.
What were some of the
Yeah, right. Okay,
programs
and how I got involved with the Muslim. Yeah. And when Malcolm announced the formation of the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, he threw open the doors of the Muslim Ilm to those people who were of the Muslim faith, or who wanted to become, or wanted to adopt the Muslim faith, to join the Muslim Mosque Incorporated. So I went to Malcolm and asked if I could become a member of the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and he said, of course. He said, but Brother Herman, you are an assistant principal in the New York City school system, and if that word gets out, the newspapers get word of the fact that you have joined my organization, you're likely to lose your job. You'll get fired. And so how are you going to support your family and support yourself? So he said, I think it would be better if we didn't mention that you are part of the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, but you're certainly welcome to become a part of that organization. And so I joined the Muslim Mosque Incorporated and served in that organization until Malcolm, a few months after that, after he made his second trip to the Middle East, came back and formed the Organization of Afro-American Unity, when I joined that organization and became the the chairman of the Education Committee. And that's what my connection was, and how I got involved with the Muslim Mosque Incorporated and the Organization of Afro-American Unity.
I just want to pursue this a little bit more because the OAAU is the most important thing, but just Muslim Mosque Incorporated. Were there any activities that you took part in Muslim Mosque Incorporated? Any programs, any things that they did that you remember?
Well, I went to their meetings, and I attended where they held their religious meetings. But in terms of a program, any kind of a program, no, I didn't get involved with any kind of program that they had because it wasn't until the the Organization of Afro-American Unity came into existence that we began to develop programs that would work towards the benefit of our people and to other people.
Okay. It was after Malcolm's first trip to Africa that he started to form the Organization of Afro-American Unity.
Yeah, he started it, but he announced it after he came back from that second trip to Africa. But he started it when he made that second trip there.
What inspired Malcolm to form the Organization of Afro-American Unity? What led him to that conclusion?
Well, first of all, he realized that black people needed some sort of organization, some sort of organizational strength, an organization that could promote the program that black people wanted to have promoted and could get them the kind of recognition as human beings that the United States government was denying to them. And so he looked around in Africa as he moved around and sought revolutionary type organizations that he could form or pattern his organization that he would form after. And he noted that there was an organization, the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, which all of the African countries, most of them, belonged to, those who were enlightened or who were progressive. And he met with the heads of those countries, Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, and so on, Jomo Kenyatta, and so on. And he was impressed by those men and their commitment to the human rights of their people and the freedom of their people and getting out from under the yoke of the United States. And he said, I will form an organization like this. And then he decided, however, instead of calling it the OAU, he would call it the OAAU, Organization of African American Unity. But it was patterned after the African organization, the OAU. And this was the organization that represented the forward-seeking, forward-inclined African nations before the United Nations and in the world community.
Who were some of Malcolm's, because it's often, people often treat the OAAU as just Malcolm's creation. He just ran everything, but he had advisors, intellectual advisors and others. Who were some of the people that helped shape the platform and program of the Organization of Afro-American Unity? And what role did some of them play in doing that?
Okay, well, I'll speak about the ones that I knew myself, and Malcolm's dependence on the support and help of these people. John Henry Clark was one. That's the first name that comes to mind. John Killens, the writer. Clarence Jones, who was a lawyer.
Ben Yochanan.
Dr. Ben Yochanan.
Chanan.
Let's see who else. These were people who stepped forward and identified with Malcolm in a public manner. And there were many others, maybe I should qualify that, there were others who supported Malcolm, what he believed in, and acted as advisors. We referred to them as his kitchen cabinet. These were people that Malcolm met with secretly. We heard names that were mentioned. Some of the names are of people who are still alive and would surprise you. Some of the people were entertainers, professional entertainers. Some of them were college professors. Some of them were people who were outstanding in their own fields of achievement, but who believed what Malcolm believed in and supported him, but because they could not afford to step forward publicly and be identified with Malcolm, they chose to support him behind the scenes. Sometimes Malcolm would mention how he would meet entertainers, for instance, when he would be traveling around the country, around the world. And he would speak about having been on the same plane along with Dizzy Gillespie, a well-known musician at that time, and how he was very surprised that Dizzy had so many progressive ideas in terms of what he believed in. And so many other people, musicians and other people, that these people supported Malcolm behind the scenes and gave Malcolm the kinds of go-ahead that he welcomed, and that gave him the understanding that there were people in key positions who were willing to support him. And so he continued to carry on his work.
You may not know this, but this is what you call inside information. I see a few people not taking notes. You're fools. Anybody sitting in here not taking notes, you ought to have a lobotomy, because this is information ain't in no book. You know? And people who've interviewed him haven't asked him these questions. You know what I mean? This is profound, powerful information. Could you talk a little bit about RAM, what its objectives were, and its relationship to Malcolm? This is important because it shows the relationship of revolutionary, in this case, young black revolutionaries' relationship to Malcolm.
RAM was a revolutionary organization that preceded the Panther Party. It started on the campus of Wilberforce University in Ohio. The students there were concerned about the fact that the administration was mistreating students, not giving them the proper education and so on. And so they decided that some of the more progressive students, they decided that they would form an organization and contest some of the offices that were available to students on the campus, and that they would run against some of those, I don't know what you all call them, the goody-goody kids. It's the only thing I can think of. But anyway, so they did that, and but rather than use the Revolutionary Action Movement, that was a little too hard. They felt the organization, or the administration, would come down on them. They called it the what is the word? I imagine he mentions it in that. But anyway, they gave it another name. It had the same initials, RAM, but it wasn't a Revolutionary Action Movement. So as to throw the administration off the track and not let them come to the conclusion that this was something more than they wanted to have on their campus. Anyway, some of their members did contest the elections and won. As a result of winning some of the elections, that organization became one of the leading organizations on the campus. And so many students began to gravitate towards that organization. They felt that they should expand that organization and bring it to young people in other parts of the United States, not only on college campuses, but in cities and towns around the United States. So Maxwell Stanford, Muhammad Ahmed, and a sister, whose name he probably mentions in that document, were commissioned to drop out of school and to go back to Philadelphia, where they came from, and to organize chapters of the Revolutionary Action Movement, and to organize these chapters around the country. In the process, Max Stanford was commissioned to go and meet with a brother named Robert Williams. Rob Williams was a secretary of a chapter of the NAACP, believe it or not. A real revolutionary brother who had been trained by the United States Army, but who believed that black people had the right to arm themselves against the United States government and to fight the United States government for their human rights. Because of his activities, a warrant was issued by the United States government to arrest Rob Williams, and as the brother mentioned, a conspiracy was cooked up that accused him of attempting to kidnap a white couple and hold them against their wishes. So Rob Williams went underground and went to Cuba, where he proceeded to publish a magazine, a leaflet, not a leaflet, a newsletter, yes, called The Crusader, in which he openly called for revolution in the United States, led by the Revolutionary Action Movement. Max Stanford went to Cuba and met with Rob Williams and wanted Rob Williams to become a co-chair of the Revolutionary Action Movement. And the other co-chair was to have been Malcolm. Malcolm would have been the spokesman for the Revolutionary Action Movement. Rob Williams would have been the leader of the revolution. This never came to be. Malcolm felt that the Revolutionary Action Movement would put him in a position that would play into the hands of his enemies in the United States government. So he felt that while he could support the aims and objectives and the policies of the Revolutionary Action Movement, he would be wiser not to become involved with the movement, because then it would cut his legs out from under him. And so he did not become active in the Revolutionary Action Movement, although they did want him to be the spokesman for the movement. And they wanted Rob Williams to be the leader of the revolutionary aspect of the Revolutionary Action Movement. And so these are things that are not spoken about. There was another organization that Malcolm was very close to, the Black Brotherhood Association. This was an association of young black men, basically situated in New York City, in Harlem, whose aims and objectives were to take up the fight of the black people in the United States against the United States government to kill police officers and to lead the revolution. Malcolm was accused by the newspapers of being part of that organization. Although Malcolm never admitted to that and said that he was not a member of that organization, I tend to believe him, because again, if he had affiliated himself with such an organization, it would have given the United States government open sesame on Malcolm because of the aims and objectives of that brotherhood. They would have had every reason for a conspiracy theory that to be developed, and that Malcolm could have been assassinated behind that. So there were a lot of organizations that Malcolm was affiliated with that were not known about. And another thing is that the Panthers themselves have admitted that they themselves are an offspring of Malcolm's leadership, and what he was calling for against the United States government. The Panther Party said that they grew out of Malcolm's program. And so Malcolm had said that one of the things that he wanted to do was to give off or to sponsor organization of youth who would at some point head up the revolution in the United States of America.
Mr. Skinny, I'll ask you this question. There's brief references every now and then to the fact that when Malcolm met with liberation movements in Africa, that at some point he talked about recruiting black soldiers to go to Africa and fight an armed struggle.
Yes.
What do you know about that?
That was something that Malcolm was very, very tight-lipped about. I think that there are laws on the in the government of the United States government that
the Israelis couldn't do it, but we can.
Yeah, right. Anybody who organizes or assists a country that is at war with the United States government can be accused of serious crimes, and the penalties that can be exacted against them could be life-threatening. And so Malcolm, while I'm sure he took the position that he was willing to assist and help any organizations or individuals in the United States to take up arms against the United States government, he could not come out openly and say that. So I will say that I do believe that is something that Malcolm would have encouraged. Anybody who wanted to take up arms against the United States government and its policies against its citizens would have found Malcolm on their side. So you can read between the lines. You're intelligent people. You're college students, right? You raise your hand. Aren't you among us? Aren't you our leaders? Huh? Our thinkers? Huh? So, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish your point.
Yeah, that was about it.
Just to pursue this to the end, because we're wrapping this up. It appears that by the end of his life, Malcolm had moved to a revolutionary position. Do you think so? What did that consist of in your mind?
I think that Malcolm was aware of the fact that for the black man to win the respect and the respect of the United States government, he needed some kind of organization that would speak to the need for black people to have some kind of power. And that power would best be expressed in the form of a nation with a flag and an army. Malcolm was willing to follow all of the international norms and rules and regulations regarding formation of nations, how nations were accepted in the community of nations, how nations became members of the United Nations, and how nations fought their wars against other nations. So knowing that, Malcolm understood that it would be necessary for his people to, at some point in time, to take up arms against the United States government. These are my words. I'm not putting these words into Malcolm, but it's how I read Malcolm. I think that Malcolm was prepared to go all the way. And he had no respect for or no reason to support those Uncle Toms who were calling for loving your neighbor or your enemy. And when your enemy struck you on the cheek, turn the other cheek and let him strike you on that cheek. Malcolm was 110% serious, sincere, and prepared to go all the way. I've never, not during the time that I knew him while he was alive, nor since his death, have I ever read anything or heard anything that has caused me to doubt that Malcolm was totally committed to the liberation of his black nation. And I cannot say that about any other leader that I've ever known or read about other than Malcolm. You may not agree with what I've said, but I've read a lot about Malcolm. I've talked to people who knew Malcolm. I talked to Malcolm. When Malcolm would be alone sometimes in our office, I used to approach him and deliberately ask him questions, checking him out, testing him to see the depth of his commitment. And he never came up short. He was sincere. He was a sincere man. If Malcolm told you anything, if he made a promise to you, you could believe he would carry out that promise. He would give up his life if he promised to do so, if that was necessary to keep his promise to you. I think that there may have been other men who were as committed, I don't question that, as Malcolm, who would have gone maybe as far as Malcolm did. Some of them did go as far as Malcolm. They went further than Malcolm did. But all I am saying is I was the only one that I knew myself. Malcolm was the only one that I knew myself personally and talked with and spoke with him at times when he was feeling despair, gloom, disappointment, and a lack of movement in the right direction, and displeasure with the fact that the movement was not doing what it should do. Malcolm was the first one who said that when the Ku Klux Klan and the people in Birmingham, Bull Connors, were sicking dogs on black people and turning fire hoses on them and beating them up. The answer to the problem was for black people to take their shotguns and rifles and pistols and get on planes and go down in the South and settle that problem right that way with weapons. Malcolm said this publicly. Yep.
So Huey P. Newton was, because of Malcolm X, he created his own organization, right? The Panther Party was because of the ideology of Malcolm X. Is that correct?
Say that again, I didn't quite hear.
Did Huey Newton, was he inspired by Malcolm X and the program of Black Panther Party? Was a program of Black Panther Party?
I think that the leadership of the Panther program were inspired by Malcolm. That Malcolm left a legacy, and we spread that legacy after Malcolm had gone. I think that encouraged them to, and if you look at the 10-point program, they speak about need of a nation and other things that came out of Malcolm's program. So I could say that I think that the Panthers were inspired by Malcolm, but they made a lot of mistakes. You know, they made a lot of mistakes that they shouldn't have made, that they put people in positions of leadership that should have never been put in those positions of leadership. And it's just unfortunate that the Panther Party didn't realize its potential that they possessed. It's unfortunate. And I blame a lot of that, not only on the leadership, but on a lot of the Panthers themselves. A lot of the Panthers themselves were nothing but hoodlums. Yeah.
May I say something?
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things I've always heard is that Malcolm had said that what he was doing was sowing seeds, that he would not be around to see those seeds come to harvest. Mm-hmm. But he was sowing seeds, and someday they would be harvested. And the reason I'm butting in is because I'm thinking, and I always advocate for the over 100 young black men and women in the jails in this country who we call political prisoners, who set about trying to harvest some of the seeds that Malcolm spread, who very actively engaged this government in some cases.
Other questions? Yes.
How was your role played? I mean, as your husband is a revolutionary, I mean, how did you play in that role? I'm sure you did, but how was it?
I'm not the wife that sent him out or to go and join the demonstration. I'm his second wife. And I became involved with Herman when he was arrested. And that's one thing that has not been said here, but Herman was arrested, again on conspiracy charge and whatever. And I became involved with the whole business of defense. And I think I've been working for the defense of political prisoners for over 50 years now. So that's what my role. And when he went into, then we got married along the way, but when he went into exile, I joined him. And I was in Guyana with him. He was there for 19 years. I was there for some 16 years. When he came home, he of course went to prison. And so I, of course, went out rallying and, you know, trying to get support to get people to be sure that he got free as early as possible and that we didn't get killed in the system, because you have to worry about that. And I just became more and more active, mostly through the political prisoner issue. Before that, back in the day on my own time, my activity and my activism was in education. Now you're all living here in San Francisco, so maybe, and I guess it's the same thing. But in New York City, the education of black children is criminal. That's the only word you can use. And so, as a teacher, and I was that, I fought in my classroom. I worked hard with my kids, but I also fought outside the classroom, fought the board in any way, shape, or form I could. Organized, talked to parents, and my activism was education. But when I went to Guyana, I worked in education there, but I had to cool that. When I came back, the activism got moved over to the Political Prisoner Forum. And I have been involved probably in every kind of aspect of that struggle that Herman has been involved in since I ran a newspaper for a while, a newsletter for about 10 years. That was very, very important to those people behind the wall because it was a link between them and us. And it also kept them aware of some of the things that was happening out here, what we were trying to do. And hopefully for those people out here who did buy the newspaper, kept them aware of the prisoners and what they were trying to do. So that's been my role. And I'm going to say this, and it's not very nice, but I was sitting over there, and Herman sat down, and Herman said, "Come sit near me." And the come sit near me was because he knew that if there was something that he kind of slipped on or that I would correct him, because I've been there. Okay? So it sort of, gave him, and you remember he's 92, and I listened to him today, and wow, he's so strong, and his memory is so fine. I'm 80, and I don't believe that and I'm going to reach 92, trust me, but I don't believe that my mind's going to be as sharp and as strong as his is still. But I fill in, if he misses a word or something.
You didn't have to fill in too much on this one.
No, that's what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Good question.
Yeah, let me, may I come back to you? I'm sorry. I sort of was a little short with your answer. I was making a joke, more or less. But when King appeared to be a very popular person, he was held up by the press and by the United States government, by the administration. They supported King as long as he did the things they wanted him to do. He talked about, I have a dream. That's the only speech that the white people know about. That's the only speech they tell us about. But he said many things after and before the I have a dream speech. And that was just a segment in a speech that he was making in Washington. If you look at King after Malcolm's assassination, what was King doing? Number one, he had started in Memphis, Tennessee. He was supporting the labor movement there, the garbage workers union. He was supporting their strike for better wages. Commingled with that was his interest in sponsoring the Poor People's March on Washington. He intended to bring thousands, maybe millions of poor people to Washington to tie up that city, to change the policies of the United States government. So it was right in the midst of all of that that the people who control the United States government must have sat down and said, that boy is out of hand. We got to get rid of him, and they did him in. They killed him. And I believe that if you read about, particularly the book that Pepper, I can't remember his first name, wrote about King's assassination, he puts the blame squarely on the United States government.
Military intelligence.
Yes, the military intelligence. And so while King was held up to great acclaim by the press and the other institutions of the country, yeah, they needed him because he was held up as a counterforce to Malcolm. They said they knew if we didn't have a Malcolm, we'd have to manufacture a King. We'd have to create somebody like him. So they killed Malcolm, and then they killed King. But King had begun to get out of line. He wasn't following the script like he should have. And so somebody has asked me, I wonder if somebody here would eventually have asked me that. Would King have eventually joined Malcolm, or would Malcolm have joined King? What do I think about that?
Yeah.
It's a good question. You look at that, there were two leaders. And while I had I wasn't a King person. He just rubbed me the wrong way. He was just a Baptist minister selling pork chops. Do you understand what I mean by that? You don't understand. No, you're too young. You know, don't you? Anyway, but if those two men had ever been able to work out their differences and have come together, there's no force under the sun that could have prevented this from being a totally different world that we live in today.
Well,
and then, speaking about my wife, this is the apple of my eye. And I would say to you, I'm going to go ahead and say it, to you brothers, because the white man has all the power, but we ain't got no power. If you can find yourself a woman like this, do whatever you have to do. Kidnap her. Do anything, but hold on to her. Don't let her get away. Everything that I've ever tried to do, this sister has supported me. She has supported me when I've wanted to say to her, but how, I'm not always right. Well, I know she sends you, I know you aren't, but I still support you. It is our women, our black women, who are going to bring about the change in our situation in this country and in this world. Now, some of you young brothers, some of you still in your teens, I imagine. You might look at me and say, that old man is crazy. Maybe I am. But my life has taught me that I owe everything to women like this one. My wife, my mother, my sisters, cousins, and so on. And if we can ever elevate the black woman to the position where we give her the kind of accolades that she has earned and deserves, then things are going to change for us. And until we do that, we're still going to be running around here with your pants sagging down at the waist, your do-rags, and that's right, you're college kids. Yeah, they don't know what a do-rag. But anyway, I would say
something that covers up a conch, which is a fried head.
Yeah. And then I guess I've talked enough. I just want to say one other thing. Malcolm was committed to young people and the fact that young people were the future for our race and for the human race. And that until we took that task on, until you took that task on, you would have all of the nonsense that's going on in this world today, with the people who are being held up to you as leaders, as role models, and who are getting you nowhere, until you begin to change yourselves, to understand that you're going up the wrong street, the wrong way, what is happening to our people is going to continue. And I hope that somebody in here today, some brother, some sister, will take under consideration the things that I've tried to say to you today. I don't have much time left. My time is almost gone. All my sisters and brothers are gone. There were 5 of us. All of them are dead. I'm the last Ferguson, other than some of my own children, my 2 sons. There are no more Fergusons. And I ain't about to make any more Fergusons. Even if I could, I don't think that I would. So I hope that somebody in this group today will be enlightened by something I may have said, unwittingly or wittingly, and accept the fact that I'm serious. I'm serious as cancer. I'm serious. And I wish that I could have done more. And I should have done more. And I hope that some of you will dedicate yourselves, instead of trying to be the next rap star. They are necessary, I suppose. But are they? You know? I hope that you will be able to understand what I'm saying, and that this will be a better world because you have heard me today and have listened to other people like me, have read some of the books that have been written by people like me. And one last thing, be sure that you make yourselves acquainted with the political prisoners, those brothers and sisters who tried to do what we were trying to do, who fought back.
I spoke on that.
I know. I'm just supporting what my wife has said. All right, and thank you very much again.
Can I do a commercial?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I said a commercial on Sunday. Shakur, she has flyers on Sunday evening at Marcus Bookstore in Oakland. There will be a book signing. Herman and I have collaborated on the book, The Story of His Life, right? It's entitled An Unlikely Warrior. And so we're going to be presenting that book Sunday night at 6 o'clock?
No, it's from 4 to 6, Sunday afternoon.
No, Sunday afternoon from 4 to 6. Now, some of you, you've heard so much from him, but I hope that you will go back, take those flyers. Be interested enough to come back out again. Come with a friend. And, yeah, like I said, there will be the book signing. With it, that's what nobody's selling books for. But whether we sell your book or not, I hope you will come out and come with a friend and the like. It's, much of what you heard here is sort of encapsulated in the book, An Unlikely Warrior, because it is just a timeline of Herman's life and events.